Thanks to everybody for joining us today to hear about what Sean and I have been working on. I'm just going to share my screen. I don't think it should make any difference, but I do have an issue with my virus software that occasionally there's a pop-up, but I don't think you'll see it, but just ignore it if you do. I'll get rid of it. Okay, so today Sean and I are going to be presenting research we've been doing since May, which we initially thought this will be great. We can do a short evidence paper on the emerging evidence so far, and then that was followed by a tsunami of evidence and analysis. So this has taken a bit longer than expected, but I think we're really proud of the paper, and it's had good feedback with peer reviews and so on, but it has definitely been a bit mammoth. So what you're getting today is a bit of a whistle stop through a long piece of work. So just to let you know, in terms of the approach that we took, this is a review of emerging evidence, and we have looked at trying not to just report what we found, but actually think about original insights and adding some value, hopefully, to the field. However, it's not like it's not like a systematic review where we've had a lot of peer review output. So we've aimed for a rigorous enough approach to selection and analysis in this. We tried as much as possible to look at bodies of evidence wherever we could, so not just single pieces of analysis or case studies or so on, to try to draw some conclusions if we could. We have used a rigorous enough, we hope, selection criteria, but also there's a lot of material coming out in blogs and things like that, and we didn't want to discount that because there's some really important potential information and evidence emerging from there, but we did think about things like credibility of the author and whether the analysis was based on underpinning research and so on. We haven't excluded anecdote, but we've tried to be clear. One thing that we've done throughout where we can is to try to surface areas of consensus and contestation. So where there have been some debates about what's being observed, we've tried to include that. And one of the main purposes of the paper really was to try to pull out some evidence gaps. So where could and should research be commissioned in the future? We were inspired along the way by a paper that I wrote with an FCDO co-author, Peter Evans, who leads the Governance, Conflict, Inclusion, and Humanitarian Research team there, where we looked at what in the early stages we were starting to observe. And so in looking at the evidence, we were trying to find what Peter and I called these existing cracks in the system. So where COVID might be hitting existing cracks around growth, development, and stability, or where there were existing problems that might have been worsened by COVID or COVID responses. With the paper, as you'll see, we didn't focus on specific topics or geographies. That's not how we've structured it, and we'll show you the structure in just a minute. Instead, we really tried to think about cross-cutting themes. And for any of you who've ever seen Marilee Grindle speak, one of her analogies she often uses is taking a from the balcony approach. So Nahir, this one's for you. And that just means, trying to step above and look at what you're seeing from outside the hullabaloo down in the bottom. Finally, this is a development-oriented piece of work, but it became really clear as we went that we would not be able just to look at lower middle-income countries, and that actually a lot of the evidence also applied to some high-income countries as well. So we do include some examples there. Before we kick off, a couple of caveats. I mean, when I say this has been like catching a moving train since May, it really has been. It's been hard to stay on top of what's emerging and to sift it as well. The paper includes, we reckon, about 400 pieces of evidence or analysis that we've looked at. And we're sure there will be people who say, well, you didn't include my paper on such and such. We can't include everything, but we think we've been pretty comprehensive. we also say here that everything we say should be considered provisional. And I liked these two pieces, this paper and this analysis here. We don't know if we're in the beginning of the pandemic or near the middle or the end. So we don't actually know how things are going to turn out. And we try to be really careful not to try to overclaim. We observed in the evidence a lot of potentially seeing what we as researchers want to see, or we as policy people want to see in terms of the emerging evidence. So we tried to check our priors, as they say, and to not do the same ourselves. However, in the first draft, we didn't get that right all the time, and some really great peer reviewers called us out when we were wanting to see something in it as well. So we've tried to be really cautious. But COVID evidence right now, there's a lot of excellent work, and there's a lot of excellent work that can sometimes be diminished a bit by overclaiming. And we've tried to be careful with that. And just to give you an example of how easy this is with COVID, for those of you who know ACLED, the conflict tracking center, we have two maps here. So the one on the left looks at political disorder from March to June in 2020, and the one on the right looks at September 6th to September 12th. And when you first look at it, one of the things you might observe, for example, is between June and September, Europe here is empty, and here it's one of the hotspots in terms of disorder. So a logical conclusion would be that between June and September, COVID-related disorder has increased during this time period. However, this is aggregated and disaggregated data. This is tracking over time. This is a snapshot. So it's very, very difficult to say. Actually, you can't really compare what you see here, but what we found is in at least some of the analysis that people will do the same. And like I said, it is very easy to look at things and to draw the conclusions that you might want to see. I'm not going to read this all out. We'll have the slides available to share, but this just gives you a quick reference at what we covered. We're not going to be looking at all of this here today. But you can see that this is as comprehensive as we can be, really. And what we're going to do now is share some of these key findings, and doing so by our cross-cutting themes. So the first around power and legitimacy, second, capacity and corruption, violence, conflict, and crime, and then vulnerability, risk, and resilience. And after we do that, we'll talk a bit about the emerging gaps as well. So over to Siân. And Siân, just tell me when you want me to move the slide.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. And yeah, as Heather mentioned, this has been an absolutely fascinating and incredibly important paper to be writing now. So I feel we're in quite a privileged position. We're also in a very early stage. So yeah, as Heather said, everything's very provisional. The first point I'm going to look at is political settlements. So we're thinking about, does the plague make the state? And if so, how does it make it? What we find is there's some analysis on pre-modern pandemics. So Black Death, smallpox in the Americas. And we see some evidence there that pandemics did prompt critical junctures that changed political settlements. And the classic example used in reference to this point is about the Black Death in the UK, where Black Death contributed to the end of feudalism in the UK. So many people died from it that the peasants had a greater ability to lobby for paid labor. But the same pandemic, the Black Death in Eastern Europe, didn't lead to the same outcome. There it is said that it led to the return of the second serfdom, where actually landlords imposed greater restrictions than the peasants had experienced before. So this is this coming mainly from a classic text, which is Why Nations Fell by Acemoglu. And it's looking at the different conditions that were present before the plague hit. So in Eastern Europe, it's suggested that there was worse relationships between peasants and landlords in terms of negotiations and discussions, whereas there was already relationships that were better in the UK, and perhaps that is why there was very different outcomes. And there's also some papers that look at Central Europe in the Black Plague and suggest that the amount of deaths there increased support for inclusive political institutions. So what we see is that we know that big health crises do shape political settlements, contribute, but we don't know the direction of change. That's quite unpredictable. When we look at modern pandemics, we see the impacts have been less dramatic. And this is probably because the number of deaths is much less due to changes in healthcare, health management. So some of the examples we'd look at in terms of modern pandemics would be Ebola, HIV/AIDS, SARS, avian flu. And we see that there have been adaptations in agricultural methods in Africa. So after the Spanish flu, which was about, I think, 1916, there was a famine. And that led to changes in agricultural methods to make food more sustainable and more food secure. We also saw changes in sanitation, for example, following cholera in Europe. And we can say potentially the Spanish flu in Europe contributed to social protection and welfare expansion. So, for example, the welfare state in the UK. But actually, the Spanish flu is what they call the forgotten pandemic, where there's not a lot actually written about it, which is intriguing. And because it happened at the same time as the First World War, it's quite hard to disentangle the impact from that. And a point I'm going to follow on later is that we think modern pandemics have led to changes in pandemic preparedness. So, for example, SARS and avian flu, which say, for example, Vietnam and China experience, are often credited as why Vietnam and China locked down quicker or responded quicker to COVID-19. So the final point in this slide is to say, know your pandemic. This comes from work of Duval, which is that each pandemic is unique. It's unique in its scope, and it's how it spreads, and it's unique in the context of, the historic moment of time and the physical place where it hits. So while we can garner some useful lessons from, say, Ebola and SARS, so we have to be always taking that into perspective and knowing that it's all about the context, and the context shapes how each pandemic occurs in each geography. So one of the key lessons, for example, that came from Ebola was the important role of the community in devising local responses to Ebola, in how to manage it, and how trust between the citizens and the authorities really shaped whether people followed the guidance given by the authorities. This may give us some lessons now for COVID-19, and as Heather will follow on, trust is a really big issue that's come up a lot through our research, but ultimately it's all about context specificity. You can move on, Heather.
Okay, so as Siân said, moving on to trust. Trust is something that comes through really strongly as an absolutely crucial factor that helps to explain more effective responses, both the historic evidence as well as what we're seeing so far in COVID case studies as well. And we've put up here, it's a crucial resource, but easily squandered by bad leadership as well. And there's also plenty of evidence of this emerging too. Trust has been shown to be linked to both pre-existing legitimacy and levels of trust in leadership, in scientists and local community leaders, religious leaders as well. So it's not just about political trust at the highest level, but just general societal trust and trust in experts and so on. But then throughout COVID, very clearly sort of emerging evidence around trust sticking with good performance as well throughout. So the more capacity or capability of leadership that you see, the less likely you see a decline in trust levels going on. And there are high trust environments. Good examples, Vietnam, Mauritius, and Senegal have emerged so far, and there are others where sort of analysis suggests that the levels of trust that existed ensured that the public were compliant with some, as we all know, some really difficult lockdown responses and so on, including things that affected people very directly and personally. So the closing of schools, the closing of religious organizations and meetings and so on. But going on with the, adherence to rules on masks, curfews, and so on. Vietnam, as Siân said, was an example where they had very high levels of preparedness because of recent experience with SARS, and they coordinated incredibly well across local government. Communications were excellent, and all of those sorts of things contributed to trust either rising or staying level. There are also low trust environments. I have here Somalia, Malawi, and then the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, as well as just some examples where pre-existing low levels of trust led to protests against lockdown or just ignoring rules, low levels of belief in experts in the government or so on, and increased openness to disinformation and conspiracy theories, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But also fear of uptake in medical services as well. So a fear that in identifying as somebody who had COVID, that there would be repercussions. We've also seen in the evidence that trust isn't linear, and it's actually quite hard to predict. People spoke early on about a trust honeymoon, including places like Brazil, the UK, and the US, where the initial response was very poor, but still people were willing to give governments a chance, so to speak, in terms of high levels of trust. But that was lost as the response continued to be poor. In Senegal, a country that started out as a high trust environment, there are actually some worrying signs that trust levels are plummeting. And the suggestions are those are going hand in hand with two things. One is the economic impact of the crisis, and also increasing evidence of disinformation as well. So even in a high trust environment where things have been probably about as good as you can get as a response, that's happened as well. One of the interesting things where there isn't enough evidence to say that this is definitely going to happen, but it's at least something to look out for, is that the trust dividend, so to speak, that can be incurred by governments that have performed very well can also raise expectations going beyond that. So in Vietnam, apparently there has been a growing public demand for the same sort of responsiveness, coordination with local government, openness and transparency and so on to continue, with people in effect saying, you've done this so well, then you surely can do everything else just as well. And that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out for the regime there. And one last point, there has been quite a lot of analysis on women leaders and women leaders outperforming male leaders in the crisis so far. There's been very little research on this. There's been one recent paper that tried to do something very systematic, and they basically say from the beginning that very sadly, there are too few data points to be able to say anything really conclusive, because there are just too few women leaders in the world to be able to say that it definitely comes down to gender, no matter what they hold for. But there does seem to be something about a particular type of kind of macho leadership that refuses to, that is very high, willing to take high risks, so won't lock down early, that doesn't communicate well, that won't coordinate with local government or the opposition or so on. That does seem to be that it's a particular type of leadership that's really struggling right now, as opposed to it being something about men or women, but more to be uncovered as time goes on, obviously. On disinformation, you often see disinformation discussed alongside trust in the evidence. And going back to the Black Death in the Middle Ages, there's a long history of disinformation actually feeding distrust and negatively impacting responses. In COVID, there have been a number of examples where we've seen disinformation come through, including, say, local rumors about, some examples here: COVID is a curse from God, it's migrant workers or immigrants who are bringing the disease here, that it's just a conspiracy from political elites because they want to get away with something or to postpone elections. It's a Western conspiracy, and so on. But worrying, actually it's all worrying, but one of the things that's been quite interesting to see is increasing evidence of organized transnational disinformation campaigns. And the evidence on this is still kind of being built, but certainly it looks like at least some of this is linked to extremist groups, white nationalist groups and other extremist groups, or even hostile state actors. And the usual suspects are often blamed in these. So Bill Gates features now because of the Gates Foundation, but George Soros, anti-vaxxers, anti-Islam, anti-China, anti-feminists, and so on. But a great example of seeing the transnational nature of this is that you had these emerging 5G conspiracy theories in the UK. These led to almost 80 mobile phone masts being burned. And at the same time, similar things were happening in Nigeria with the same sorts of rumors and language emerging as well. There is some evidence starting to look at whether or not a free media or the role that a free media plays as opposed to a less free media. And some analysis is suggesting that the lack of a free media is enabling states to deliberately mislead the public. So whether that's by misreporting or underreporting cases and deaths, and so trying to manipulate how their performance is being seen. So Belarus, Iran, and Tanzania as just 3 examples. Some recent analysis is also looking at how states might be misusing or abusing disinformation laws to limit or target critics, and particularly journalists. This is not a great time for investigative journalists. In China and India, there were a number of arrests. Here in the UK was issued with a level 2 warning from the Council of Europe for media freedom, for example, when they banned open democracy journalists from their COVID-19 briefings. And there are a number of examples like that. All of this then links back to levels of trust as well. So this then gets linked to a debate that started very early in the analysis and evidence around authoritarianism versus democracy. And there's a huge number of pieces of analysis and evidence around this. So trying to assess whether one model of governance or another has been more effective or not. A lot of very passionate arguments being made and other sort of slightly less passionate, but generally speaking, the evidence is really inconclusive on this. In fact, some of the early claims about a rise in authoritarianism that were ascribed to evidence of centralization of executive powers, human rights violations, and so on. Now more and more people are saying, well, actually, a lot of this was probably just what emergency politics looks like. And VDEM have been tracking democratic standards throughout the crisis. And they've recently concluded that so far, again, everything provisional, most democracies have already suspended or didn't really abuse the emergency standards and the emergency measures in terms of democratic standards. And most of the countries that did were autocratic before the pandemic anyway. So we for the most part, have seen what you would expect to see, basically. Cooper and Aitchison, so researchers at LSE, have said that what we should be looking at going forward, instead of sort of looking at observations of authoritarian behavior as one-off events, to actually look at patterns of behavior. And there are others looking at everyday authoritarianism, saying the same sorts of things. But they say that there are 3 factors that coming together are where you get really worried. So one is crony capitalism. So giving out lots of contracts to your friends and allowing that to rewrite basically the rules of the state. Democratic erosion, so ignoring or undermining democratic institutions consistently. And then finally, again, this toxic masculinity or ethnic nationalist rhetoric in politics as well. And 2 countries that they had said that met all 3 of those conditions throughout. So one was Hungary and sadly also the UK as well. And one of the things that's been interesting with looking at this body of evidence around authoritarian and democracy is how much you see it's shaped by geopolitics and what is likely to be this really growing fault line as we go on between China and the US or between East Asia and West in terms of who's getting the COVID response right or not. And that seems to be at least a motivation for some of the analysis around authoritarianism versus democracy on either side of the argument. Well, this is a big patch for me. I'll stop in just a minute. But with elections, I know that there's huge interest. We've seen a lot of interest in this and follow up on things John and I have done for policymakers on evidence on elections, but there really are just too few data points to say there haven't been enough elections to be able to say something conclusively about patterns of behavior. Some countries have held their elections regardless with low turnout and so on, others have delayed them. In both cases, governments face criticism. And one of our peer reviewers wrote a note basically saying, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, as a leader. And it's not clear whether one approach is better than the other. Our own Nick Cheeseman and others have said that actually one of the things with COVID specifically, and this is no year pandemic, is that it could lead to more unplanned elections than normal because of the way it actually targets leaders that fit the demographic profile for the disease. So a lot of older leaders in particular. And Nick has talked about how in personalized political systems in particular, this could be destabilizing and trigger some big succession battles. There has been some good emerging evidence around technological innovation. So really trying to move some of the digital voting agenda forward. There are some risks here, including abuse of these systems and their and how far they can actually reach. And they will take time to develop and deliver in places. So it's not going to be a short-term help likely for elections coming up in the next year, but certainly this is sparking some real innovations and rethinking voting. So, Siân.
Thanks, Heather. So thinking about capacity, so the capacity state or other actors have to respond to COVID-19. So epidemics and pandemics are characterized by uncertainty and urgency, and each disease is unique in its transmissibility and its form, spreading quickly, which means action needs to be quick and adaptive. And that is actually really complicated, as we've seen very rarely in this country. So typical containment measures, I'm sure everyone is aware of, we've been reading about it all the time: social distancing, lockdown, quarantine, isolation. These are classic public health measures and have been used throughout history to reduce the spread of diseases. So while we use a blanket term lockdown and social distancing, actually the reality of how those policies are enacted are very different across the world. This actually makes it really difficult to draw generalizable conclusions. So if we think about the impact of COVID and COVID responses, it's again very much contingent on the context. And while there's a lot of popular debate about the effectiveness of those responses, we don't really know what effectiveness means yet. And I think we will only know that in the longer term. So far, we could look at the immediate health response, and mortality rates could be, is the broadly used proxy for effectiveness right now. And that's based on past evidence of pandemics and how we measure their effectiveness, in terms of responses. But it's also on the reality of the health crisis causing so many deaths. But in time, our understanding of effectiveness will broaden to possibly include things like, the initial conditions of the environment, the economic and social impacts over time of the same responses, the broader health impacts. So it's quite difficult right now to say what is an effective response, what has been. It's widely suggested that countries with previous modern experiences of pandemics have been more effective in their responses. And whilst we have thought about pandemic preparedness for a long time, especially in all countries really to some degree, but especially in more developed countries, practical preparedness of actually what was the reality of preparedness seems to be quite different to the strategic preparedness that some countries have, like the UK. So what we're thinking about in terms right now of what's effectiveness is the containment dividend. Those countries that locked down quicker and more effectively, that got contact tracing processes more quickly up to speed. So the country like Vietnam, again, is often used as this example. Only time will tell when we can balance out all the other impacts that have occurred, whether that is successful compared to other countries. But the case of Vietnam is actually really impressive if you think about we would think it would have been at much higher risk from the direct and indirect impacts of COVID due to having a long land border with China and due to having a much less developed health system than many other countries. So this idea of strategic pandemic preparedness is an interesting point that really will get discussed a lot over the next few years as well, of countries that have well-resourced health systems and had pandemic policies in place, like the UK. So there's a couple of articles that are beginning to discuss this. Why is there an apparent discrepancy or maybe no correlation between countries we thought that were well prepared for pandemic and the reality and what seems to be how effective they've been? And the salient point that comes out of this and comes throughout our paper is that it's all about the politics. So no matter how prepared your country might be, in many shapes, if your political system is in one way that decisions are made maybe slower or quicker, or with certain political imperatives, or perhaps with less or more openness in terms of the press, in terms of scrutiny, that will have a big role to play. And what we find is that these analyses before COVID of pandemic preparedness weren't able to take into account political factors. And of course, political factors change all the time, especially when a new government comes in. So one of the biggest points that comes out through the literature is about social protection. So social protection expansion is one of the key responses to COVID-19. But of course, it's limited by institutional and fiscal capacity constraints. So there's a lot of literature emerging about India, which is a really interesting example, where the state actually did expand its social protection quite well, but lots of people who weren't already engaged with the government systems were not able to access that support. So actually, it was a lot of civil society organizations and regional governance organizations and family networks that stepped up to fill that space. The example of India is also very interesting in terms of lockdown. So they instigated a very strict lockdown quite quickly and with limited notice to people, and having a very big population within that moves for work, a internal migrant population. Many people moved back to their hometowns because without work, they would be unable to continue to live for many days. But many people in most of the countries around the world are only a few days away from hunger. And therefore, locking down in those situations has been very complex. And expanding social protection in those contexts has also been very complex. So the last sort of point I'm going to raise here is about policymaking in complex compound crises. So we could look at COVID as being a compound crisis, which means that it's not just one crisis, a health crisis, it's also an economic crisis and a social crisis and a governance crisis, all coming together. And what's unique about COVID-19 is that it's not just happening in one location, it's happening across the world, in every country of the world to various levels. So it's an extremely challenging environment in which to make policy. It's characterized by uncertainty, complexity, and need to respond at speed and scale with high potential costs. So this is where a lot of the work that some of our colleagues like Heather and Nihir, who's on the line, have been doing about adaptive policy making come into action. So ongoing learning, analysis, and policy adaptation is key in this environment, and setting up governance structures that are able to do that are also key. There's some interesting evidence from Ebola, actually, from Liberia, which looks at special governance mechanism that was made to respond to the Ebola pandemic there. And it had a very different governance structure to the way that a lot of our policy decisions are made normally in normal environments. So framing COVID-19 as a collective action problem is important because it's a problem which cannot be solved by just one sector working on it. It's multi-sector, it's multi-actor, and of course it's also global, happening across all countries. And a lesson from Ebola was that pandemic should be declared from the beginning as a humanitarian crisis, so that it has the level of crisis, which means governance mechanisms can work much quicker and develop different ways of working. And if you could move over the slide. Over to you, Heather.
Thanks. So going from Siân's happy story of cooperation and collaboration and so on to corruption, fraud, and kleptocracy. So the things that are most likely to undermine state capacity, cooperation, and so on. We can't even begin to give you enough examples, really, of just to demonstrate how dispiriting it's actually been to spend the past 4 months embroiled in the literature around these issues. And just wondering what is wrong with people, and because the scale is so high. Before I talk about this, just very quickly, we keep mentioning Vietnam, and I think unless something has changed, I mean, just to give a sense for how impressive it is, Vietnam has a population of around 100 million people, and they've had 0 deaths. So that's how good the response has been. Anyway, corruption and fraud certainly are 2 areas where there is very clear evidence. We don't have to even say emerging evidence. There's very clear evidence of direct and widespread impact on levels of corruption and fraud. The evidence on kleptocracy is more emerging, but no less interesting or worrying. With corruption and fraud, this cuts across everything. So private and public sectors, country levels, so high, middle, low, capacity levels, regime type, whatever, and genuine concern at a global level, national, and so on, that the impact of this is likely to be unprecedented. And that is, quite possibly in terms of social unrest and economic impacts and all sorts of things. The main reasons for this surge, so one is ignoring the extensive evidence with previous crises. So when COVID first hit, the immediate response was to stop everything and to go for urgency. We needed to be able to contract as quickly as possible, and this happened all around the world. You contract first, worry about corruption later. Every bit of experience in conflict in other situations tells us that's not the way to do things, but that is still what seems to have happened in a lot of places. That was matched with an unprecedented demand for certain types of equipment as well, which meant that that creates a market for less salubrious types, but also states willing to bypass normal procedures. Emergency procurement procedures that didn't just allow for non-competitive tendering, but also suspended other transparency and accountability systems in the chain. And also just the inability of watchdogs to do their jobs because they were locked down and didn't have access to the systems that they needed to keep track of things as well. We're all seeing that some evidence of kleptocrats, political cronies, and other politically connected persons using the crisis to capture state contracts and working with political elites to reshape the rules. There are a worrying number of stories increasing around auditors, investigative journalists, and other whistleblowers and others being attacked or killed. In Liberia recently, 4 of the auditors working on COVID contracts have been killed in the last couple of weeks. I mean, that's worrying and unprecedented as well. This is just talking about the COVID crisis itself, and there's real growing fear about what's going to happen with the building back better investment that's likely to come. So all of the emergency funds being put into the economy, any infrastructure, any building of systems or so on, and the amazing opportunity that this opens up for corruption unless things change and change quickly. However, with this, this is one of the few areas where there's also a lot of evidence of good news too, including a lot of rapid e-governance innovations, increasing commitments to open data, open contracting, and so on. And for the first time, real genuine multilateral cooperation, including at the IFI level that we've not seen before as well.
Moving on to gender-based violence, this is actually the main and most important direct impact that we can see in terms of violence and conflict. That's an increase in gender-based violence that we can see in every country in the world. I think this is a really, really damning impact. And it also highlights the importance of human security over what we traditionally consider what security is. this is, for me, I was surprised but not surprised at this. We actually see that in every crisis throughout history, as far as we can examine them, gender-based violence tends to increase during crises. That's during pandemics, during economic crises, during conflict, during environmental crises. So this means an increase in intimate partner violence, child sexual abuse, human exploitation and trafficking, etc. And this is due to things like forced isolation, perhaps with abuses, or new abuse being triggered by the stress of isolation. It's also occurs because of prolonged confinement, leading to negative coping strategies like substance abuse. There's been increased violence against health workers, which health workers are predominantly female. And also the loss of income and livelihoods has been increasing the conditions for violence. So at the same time we see this increase, we see there's been a decrease in services available for violence protection and prevention. So this has actually compounded the problem. So one example, it's not just that these services have decreased by people, say, being locked down and not being available, but also a lot of people don't have the technology to access these services when they can't go in person. So for example, in Yemen, there's been a hotline telecounseling services set up. Many people don't have access to a mobile phone or the privacy to make a call safely. So this trend is unfortunately likely to continue while COVID continues. Of course, lockdown policies are being relaxed and re-implemented at different periods in different contexts all the time. So those conditions are changing, but the economic conditions are actually getting worse across the world as the economic crisis deepens. So unless we have serious policy responses with proper investment and a lot of effort, this will continue to increase. And there are lots of innovations occurring as policymakers are seeing this to be such a problem. If you could move to the next slide, Heather. In terms of other forms of violence and conflict, we see quite a mixed picture. So in terms of social unrest, violence by state forces and protests, there are some but limited direct forms of violence we can say COVID-19 has caused or prompted. We've seen some protests against lockdown measures. We've seen hunger protests, for example, in Chile, as people lost jobs and were unable to eat. They protested about that. But there's a lot of unrest, which, just admitting someone to the conference, which we can't link directly to COVID. So this is a point I think Heather raised at the beginning, which is in our paper, we tried to draw apart what things are being directly caused by COVID-19, what things are being exacerbated by COVID-19, what things are being made more visible, and what things are just happening at the same time. So like I say, there's a complex picture with this. We do have lots of historic examples of where food insecurity has increased unrest. So the Arab Spring is a big point. So a lot of the literature warns that we can expect unrest to increase, but as yet we don't have a lot of evidence for that. Next slide, please, Heather.
Okay, we included organized crime in the section on conflict and violence because it was one of the interesting observations at the beginning of COVID was that you saw a rapid decrease in organized crime violence. Most people may not know that organized crime violence is much higher than violence due to conflict and war and due to terrorism or so on. So seeing that immediate drop was really positive. Since then, when things have opened up, it's unclear how long that's going to last. Early on, we also saw evidence of what's been called gang governance or gang altruism. So criminal gangs in Brazil famously enforcing lockdown, or in South Africa, drugs trafficking gang providing food to vulnerable people isolated in communities. But over time, this seems to be, this hasn't continued. So it's been mostly NGOs now providing those services as well. Some people have suggested that what has happened could boost organized crime gangs' legitimacy and their soft power, but there really isn't conclusive evidence on this yet, but definitely something to be watching. What we do know from previous crises, so this goes, back to Italy with the mafia, or Japan with the Yakuza after World War II, or after any number of crises, is that organized crime gangs are some of the most adaptive in terms of taking advantage of the situation, and so becoming more powerful and more embedded within particular communities or politics or sectors, whatever it might be. And really using those points of crises to build their power base. And so organized crime must be one of the big areas that we really keep an eye on. There's already evidence of extensive adaptability. So we're seeing a rising demand in gold as investors are increasingly worried about economic climate. And so artisanal gold mining has been targeted by organized crime, working with growing money laundering operations in Dubai, for example, as well as elsewhere, but also other smaller markets. So South Africa alcohol ban leading to bootlegging and all of that kind of stuff. There's also emerging evidence of organized crime moving more and more into cybercrime as more of us are working online. And so boosting their revenue streams and not necessarily replacing other ones. And just like with corruption, there are huge concerns emerging about how organized crime is going to take advantage of any of the post-COVID Build Back Better. So things like infrastructure construction, just a whole range of areas in which organized crime has historically always been really powerful, and so on.
So in terms of war, again, the literature is very not settled. We know that COVID-19 is not causing conflict, but there is evidence that it is exacerbating existing conflict fault lines and threatening peace processes. So it's thought this is probably due to things like donor funds being under threat. Military have withdrawn in some areas, and I think the UN as well, and certain development actors have had to withdraw from areas due to the risk of catching COVID, and perhaps also strategic gaming for conflict-related purposes. So it appears that there is, increasing stretching of funds and lack of oversight in some conflict areas, and this is going to continue. So the provisions in the literature, the warnings, there's an overall pessimism about the impact COVID-19 will have, but as yet there is very little evidence to substantiate exactly what impact it seems to be happening. And there's quite a divide in the literature between more alarmist voices warning of armed groups expanding their influence and more skeptical voices urging caution due to the limited evidence base. So we know that COVID is also unlikely to resolve any deeply entrenched conflicts, but we know it will shape the war economy, and some incentives and priorities for engagement will be shaped by it. So moving on to resilience, and I don't know how much time we have left, Marissa, but
I was just going to say, Marissa, I think we have two more slides like this and then just me wrapping up. So it might be about 5 more minutes. Is that okay?
Yes, you can't hear me. Yes, that's great.
Okay, thanks.
Super. So in our paper, we bring in a resilience lens. We partly do this because the concept of resilience has been increasing a lot in terms of its use in policy spheres. It's been around for a long time. It's emerged from the disaster risk in terms of international development use. It's come from the disaster risk community, from the humanitarian community, but it's been used a lot more. And actually it does have a lot of utility in terms of COVID-19. So we know that COVID-19 has exacerbated and made visible many inequalities and structural weaknesses, and that weakens resilience for certain people to the current crisis. So at the top of this slide, I've got the definition that we're using for resilience. So it's understood as the capacities and vulnerabilities individuals, households, communities, regions, states, or systems have to absorb, adapt, and transform when confronted with hazards. So basically, in short, it's the ability people have to weather and grow from crisis. So the resilience is a little bit complicated because it's used in very broad ways. It's used across agendas, across sectors, by different actors and at different levels. So this is a big criticism of it because it can be difficult to implement. when it's used so broadly, does it have any meaning? But others say that, it's actually quite a strength. So it's attempting to bring together siloed sectors and actors to manage trade-offs and to achieve better coherence in action. And with a crisis like COVID-19, which is a compound crisis happening across different areas, this is particularly useful. So as an analytical tool, resilience centers are underpinned by complex adaptive thinking, which emphasizes complexity, change, interconnectedness, nonlinearity, uncertainty. So through this, we also bring in our understanding of COVID-19 as a complex crisis. So resilience thinking is very prominent actually in the SDGs, and the UN has a good paper they've released, I think in June, bringing back the SDG and the resilience framing. So there, the tagline is, save lives, protect societies, and recover better. It amounts to a recipe for a comprehensive response and recovery from COVID-19 that will leave no one behind and address the very fragilities and gaps that make us so vulnerable to the pandemic in the first place. It also points the way to building resilience to future shocks, above all from climate change, and towards overcoming the severe and systemic inequalities that have been tragically exposed by the pandemic. So this really emphasizes how actually the resilience framing not only allows us and makes us analyze the particularly vulnerable countries and the particularly vulnerable groups that are being affected by both the direct and indirect impacts of COVID-19, but it also gives a really big impetus, I think, for policy making to build back better. It's a bit of a, I don't know, a vague concept, build back better. It's a buzzword, it's a buzz concept, but it is emphasizing that addressing inequalities, addressing vulnerabilities, and not to say reduce funding or reduce attention just because all countries are going through the crisis at the same time. So I think, yeah, the resilience concept and lens brings us a useful analytical framing, but it also brings us a good sort of political communications tool, which I think was very important right now. So moving on. So thinking about these vulnerable countries and groups, we see a wide range of risks, like I said, direct risks to health and healthcare systems, indirect risks to economies, livelihoods, social relations, and political systems, with much longer term risks of polarization and insecurity. At the country level, there are certain factors which we think make countries and groups more vulnerable. So international exposure to international trading links or tourism, health system capacity, density of urban areas, demographics, age of the population, government transparency, trust in government, conflict pressure and magnitude, and displacement. But as we've seen with the case of Vietnam, we are not necessarily able to judge now exactly how vulnerability is playing out in concert with the politics and how it's being managed. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about vulnerable groups quite quickly, don't worry. But what we can see across countries is that COVID-19 is affecting some groups much more than others. And evidence from previous disasters shows us that disaster losses disproportionately affect poor people, as they tend to lack savings and assets, as their consumption is closer to subsistence levels. They have weaker health and education, they have less access to services, they tend more to work in informal and subsistence jobs, and they may need more time and support to adapt and transform following shocks or stresses. So one of the big findings coming from the World Bank is that they are predicting that global poverty is going to increase, and that will be the first time it has for 20 years. So that's really quite damning. COVID-19 is also likely to increase inequality within countries, as previous modern epidemics did. And that connects to risks of lowering social mobility and lowering resilience for the poorer and more vulnerable groups in the longer term. So some of the groups that are particularly vulnerable right now are urban populations, particularly slum dwellers, because they're living in densely populated areas with limited sanitary facilities and infrastructure and high levels of mobility due to their precarious livelihoods. Similarly, refugees and internally displaced people are particularly vulnerable. Again, they're more likely to live in overcrowded and unsanitary places. And they also have other factors shaping their vulnerability. Their social networks and social capital were already likely to be low prior to COVID-19, as they're away from their homes and their communities. But that's even more exacerbated with the tightening of borders and fears of spreading disease have led to scapegoating and attacks across the world. And that's one of the factors that comes out through the evidence across the world, is that there's been a lot of scapegoating of minority groups. So increasing border controls justified under COVID-19 has meant, for example, boats of Rohingya refugees have been unable to land in Malaysia and Thailand. They were both places which were more tolerant towards refugees prior to COVID-19. So women and girls also face specific vulnerabilities due to their higher economic vulnerability, as they tend to earn less, they tend to save less, they tend to hold less secure jobs, and they work more in the informal sector. There's also an increased health and work burden for frontline health workers and carers, an increase in unpaid care work due to lockdown, and increases in gender-based violence, as I've already mentioned. So there are cases, and we're seeing a lot in the media talking about how female leadership is leading to more effective and successful COVID-19 policy responses. But actually, if we look at those, they're few and far between, and they all tend to be in high-income countries, with the exception of Taiwan, mostly Western as well. So young people are also greatly at risk from COVID-19, not from the direct health impact, but due to other vulnerabilities relating to employment, education, and protection issues. They tend to have lower incomes, assets, and less job security if they're working. And when economic crises occur, they face higher and longer periods of unemployment than other groups. Another group particularly at risk is healthcare workers, and they are really essential to the COVID-19 response, but they are facing higher health and security risks due to stigma attacks, due to their heightened exposure to the disease and lack of personal protective equipment. The final group I'd like to highlight is prison populations. So they face a higher direct health risk from COVID, as they also tend to live in cramped and overcrowded conditions. They have poor hygiene standards, often there, insufficient meals and nutrition, inadequate healthcare and basic hygiene, poor health literacy, etc. So prison populations across the world also tend to be drawn from the poorest and most marginalized sections of society. Now, there have been some responses to that. So in some countries, many countries actually, governments have decided to release some prisoners. So for example, in Turkey, the government released about 90,000 prisoners. However, they didn't release prisoners convicted under a very criticized anti-terrorism framework, meaning that all political prisoners, including many women peace builders and activists, remain imprisoned and at risk. One of the last factors I'm just going to raise about prison populations is, as a group, they tend to be a group that have few champions and few people working to help protect them, and less popularity in being protected. So another reason they're at risk. You can move on, Heather.
Great, thanks. So just to wrap up, we don't have a tidy conclusion in the sense that here is exactly what the evidence is telling us about COVID-19, as you can tell, and we hope that there have been some standout points that have come up. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to just very briefly talk about what we don't know. So going forward from here, we actually don't yet have any kind of systematic way to understand and map these 4 areas. And this is something we're going to be working with the comms team at K4D about, to try to do something on this. But it's not possible yet, looking at the evidence, to understand exactly what COVID has caused, what it's exacerbated, what it's made more visible, and things that just happen to have happened at the same time. So we weren't able to do that in this paper, but we're putting this forward as a clear a framework that needs to happen going forward. We really don't necessarily have a systematic way to assess what evidence and intelligence is telling us about in terms of these things. What's an event, what's a trend, and what's a proper critical juncture. And one of my colleagues, Jeremy Arman at the FCDO, he's called this separating signal from noise. And that's still really difficult to do even at this stage. And then finally, we don't have systematic or comparative evidence that helps us to understand this idea of COVID as a compound crisis. So where in the world is it actually not the worst thing that's going on? Where is it one of many crises? Or how to identify these cracks in the system? So we're flagging these as gaps in the evidence with suggestions for future research, basically, in terms of how to do that. But right now, there's just too much noise to be able to say something systematic. We also don't really know what to do differently. And Sean's highlighted some of these, you know, that the idea of build back better.
Time, Heather.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
This is last one. So this idea of resilience or build back better, it's really not clear what this actually means or how it can be applied. It's not clear in whose interest build back better actually is, how that would align with electoral cycles or anything like that. And we don't really know about how resilience could be understood in a way that is inclusive and all of these things, but is still both politically and technically feasible, because it's so, COVID is so all encompassing, we don't really know yet. And finally, COVID is absolutely huge. It's impacted all of our lives, but there are a hell of a lot of other huge global challenges going on right now. Climate change, issues with food security that aren't COVID related, extremism, cybersecurity, all of these things are out there. They haven't stopped because of COVID. And so it's not really clear how much we pay attention to COVID or not. We didn't intend to read these anyway. We're going to provide the slides if you'd like, and they'll be in the paper, but we do go through and pretty systematically identify specific evidence gaps that we would suggest are areas that are really important when it comes to investment from research funders, and we're sharing those with people that we know in those organizations to see what they might like to commission. So on that, thank you very much.